Welcome to another episode of the ToddCast. My guest today is Chase Joynt, the director of a new documentary. As you know, June is in some ways the big month of documentary releases. I could argue it's the beginning, very beginning of the tour you make to see if you might get accolades from a place called Oscar, if you will. State of First is the documentary we're going to discuss today. My guest is Chase Joynt, the director of State of First, which is about Sarah McBride, the first transgender member of Congress. This is a documentary that began before she knew she was going to win. We have a unique way that we're going to do this. First half hour is going to be a conversation with the director. Second half hour is going to be a conversation with with Congresswoman McBride to talk about being in Congress, so that it's not just all about breaking this ceiling. But I want to talk about the documentary with Chase Joynt now. Chase, welcome to the ToddCast.
Thanks so much. So happy to be here.
So tell me the origin story of how you got this permission to be so, this is an intimate way of doing things in the moments. My favorite type of documentary where you're living it with the director, with the person that is being focused on, which means you didn't know what the ending was going to be. You had an idea. It's Delaware. Don't get me wrong. I think I kind of knew where the direction of the race was going, but you still start with some unpredictability. So tell me how it came to be.
Absolutely. So our producer, Jenna Kelly, went to college with Sarah and has long been in conversation with her about the potentials of a documentary project. And then when Sarah began the run for Congress, recognized that this was probably the most important time where a documentary crew could be invited into the scene. And I think she had a real awareness of the political propulsiveness of the moment. And so Jenna and the rest of our producing team reached out to me, and a lot of my feature film work is really reckoning with questions of trans history and trans representation. And so it felt like a really exciting extension of momentums that I already had.
So this is something you've been doing this for some time. So there was I'm guessing there had to be some comfort she had to have with the person she was working with.
Very much so. I think we both talked to each other as trans people and recognized that there was a kind of synergy there around the types of questions we might be asking. While, of course, we're very different people with very different orientations in a variety of different ways, there was a recognition that we're in a heightened moment of attention around trans community and trans rights. And we knew that we were building a project from within that space.
What were the ground rules? What were the no-go either areas or parts that you didn't? I mean, I'm going to guess there were some.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we benefited greatly from the fact that Sarah is surrounded by an excellent team who opens her schedule and manages in a variety of different ways to give us access to scenes of family behind the scenes or in the office conversations. And we really did follow the campaign lead. It's not my style as a director to push into areas where we are not welcome, but to actually think about the camera as a tool to create context, to continue to reveal the context that Sarah is working and living in. And so we said yes to every opportunity that we had and recognized, the limitations of some of those spaces as we encountered them.
Did you always have in mind how you were going to try to bring this to an end? You probably assumed she was going to win. I mean, you talked to plenty. So yes. Obviously, I don't think, really the suspense was what was going to be her reception, right? Once she got to Congress. And that became, maybe I'm still naive and I'm a pretty cynical guy. But I was surprised I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I was surprised about the initial fight over the bathroom.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of different ways to answer your question. One of which is, yes, we had a good sense that she was going to win, but we did not know what was going to be happening in the presidential election. And so the tension of Sarah's rise alongside questions of Kamala Harris's ascent and the ongoing brutality of Trump's reemergence, we knew that that was going to be a tension. And in a film that's trying to think about a politics of representation and what it means to actually be a first of any kind, there were so many different ways that we could cross in and out of those electoral stories. And then to your point, I think that, we understood that there was an incredibly volatile assault on trans rights that was brewing on the right, we could not have anticipated that Sarah would become the central focus of that
Mhm.
attention in the way that she did. And so, as a filmmaking team, we tried to walk as closely with her as possible to reveal a kind of access and a witnessing of that kind of story that we knew no one else would be able to represent.
I want you to address something early on. She says, she quotes, and I apologize for not getting the person that she quotes correctly right here, but it's a it's a quote about sort of political movements. First they ignore you, then they
Uh-huh.
mock you, then they protest you, and then you win.
Yes.
And it is fascinating. Look, she got me thinking as I was going back, right? And at first it becomes, yeah, the transgender community. There was a lot of, the gay rights movement was about the gay rights movement. And in fact, there was real fights in the gay rights movement about whether the transgender fight was worth it. And I've been privy to these debates that the Human Rights Campaign had on their board and all of these things. That's no longer the case. Although, do you still run into that in the gay rights community?
I think that, the umbrella of LGBTQ plus rights
Mhm.
emerged as a way in which to build bridges and build coalitions across minoritized
Mhm.
groups. And I think that that has had benefit. And yet, we also recognize that communities have very distinct needs and are becoming the target and focus of various sociopolitical agendas in different ways. And so I do think transness and the trans community need to be thought about as distinct in this moment on account of the
Mhm.
fact that we require coalition and solidarity and support and allyship in a different way than, say, someone who might be cis and gay identified in this very particular moment. And so I think that one of the things that the film is also trying to address and think about is, what does it
Mhm.
mean when we're organizing around a kind of politics of identity, and what are the
Mhm.
potentials and what are the limitations of those kinds of moves?
What is what do you think is the next? I mean, it's interesting here in some ways, and that's why that quote was so interesting, because in some ways, um, I think if you tell me as a transgendered American about whether you feel as if is it two steps forward, one step back? Is it feel as if progress in some ways being at the center of firestorms? Do you see it as progress, or are you frustrated, or both? Is
Uh,
the answer yes to both?
yeah, I think the answer is that progress is not linear by any stretch of the imagination, and that we're
Mhm.
moving in circles and we move backwards and forwards. And as much as I would love to say it's two forward and one back, which always keeps us moving ahead, I don't
Mhm.
necessarily think that's true. But I think that one of the things that the apocryphal quote that you're referencing, that Sarah suggests in the beginning of the film, says is that we can look to other social movements for guides,
Mhm.
for inspiration. We can look to civil rights. We can look to early queer activism as moments of intense sociopolitical pressure around certain kinds of communities and identity formations, and we can learn from them in this moment. And I think if you look back, even at those that I've just suggested, coalition and community are the ways forward. We cannot have single subjects
Mhm.
or exemplary folks who are pulled out of the pack and forced to represent a whole community or whole
Mhm.
movement. We need to be thinking together as a collective.
As a documentarian, how important is it for you to go into history? Because I say this, and I have been, I've been involved with the these film festivals now, off and on, either directly with Meet the Press or now, and there's been quite a few um, on identity.
Mhm.
And what's been really some of my favorites have been sort of on the history of sort of hidden identity, where people had to
Mhm.
hide, but they were going to. Like this great illustrator was a subject of a terrific documentary I remember a couple of years ago, and I apologize for not remembering the name, but it was about an illustrator, and he was a fashion illustrator, and there was a bit of gay erotica that he sort of both celebrated in plain sight, and people didn't
Yep.
realize that's what he was doing. Um, I feel like there's a lot more gay history, transgender history that we've just buried, right? Because society at that time didn't want to know that it existed. How much do you focus on trying to unearth um, pieces of that history? Because I think it goes a long way, frankly, to get today's society to not just accept but realize this is not new.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for saying this is not new. I feel like the more we can all collectively keep saying this is not new and trans people have been around forever, the better off we're all going to be. And I think to your question, it really is project specific for me. So some of my past features are really reckoning with trans history and the ways in which trans folks have been erased or invisibilized, sometimes strategically as a way to
Mhm.
survive their contexts. But in this film, I made a different choice, which was to say, of course, there's a version of this film that could have started with Sarah McBride as a young person and
Mhm.
charted her understanding of self as a trans person and that kind of coming of
Yeah, you
age.
never
That
got
I,
into her actual transition. That was
right,
never. It's there, meaning you allow the viewer to say, okay, okay, this happened in college, got it. So you
correct.
tell them when it happened, but you do not show it. And you're right, you could have. And then
Right.
I appreciate this explanation.
Yeah, and it's a strategic choice to not do so because I actually think it's not the story we're telling. And so if you track the coming of age in our film, it's about her political coming of age. So her
Mhm.
parents tell a very beautiful and charming story about Sarah desiring a podium from a very young
The
age.
podium is
That to
great.
me,
Yeah.
yeah, that to me is actually much more informative
By the way,
to
it
who.
made me write down a question going, so when are you running for president? Because I joke, no, I joke that the people that eventually run for president have thought about it since childhood. So that's why,
Right.
like, oh, okay.
Right. And exactly to your point, that to me is a much more interesting way to think about a coming of age or an emergence than a story about transition that might be squarely organized around one's understanding of their gender identity, which in the context of this film, I don't think is necessary. We understand that Sarah identifies as a trans person. We are immersed in a contemporary trans politic, and the rest actually can be unknown in a very important way.
What critique I was going to say critique the media on this, but instead give advice to traditional media, give advice to, because I think there's plenty of people who are trying to get this right but stumble.
Mm.
If you
Well, I think it.
and I think that you depend. I mean, Sarah McBride seems to go out of her way to give grace to the stumbles, right? And
Mhm.
you see it even with people that are trying to be allies for her sometimes stumble. That's got to be a little frustrating, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sarah's making her own choices around how she wants to be in the world around those stumbles, and I think we can look to activists and advocates of other kinds who are making other choices distinct from the
Hmm.
sort of grace making gestures that we see in politics. And I think for me, in this moment, there are two things that we can draw on actually from the film. So, one
Hmm.
is when Donald Trump says, I talk about taxes and nobody really claps or does anything, and I say the word transgender and everybody explodes, which is interesting to me because 5 years ago you didn't even know what it meant. And it's such a striking and inflammatory moment where he is showing his hand in some ways to say, I understand that I have created a scapegoat out of this community with the help of many people. And as a result, we are going to weaponize this word. We're going to weaponize this community. The faster that media can catch on to that and redraw our attention to the fact that the scapegoating of trans people in this moment is a diversion and a distraction for all these other kinds of sociopolitical machinations, the better off we're going to be. And I think it's on media to create a much more nuanced and incisive way in to shine a light on those things.
But do you worry that, so take the issue of trans sports, trans people in women's sports. It's like not a 1%, right? It's like less than a 1% issue. Do
Yes.
you worry though, when that's said, that it's can come across almost as dismissive of the idea that there are trans people wanting to compete in sports? Do you see where I'm going here? Where there's this fine line between, hey, there's hardly, what are we talking about here? This is a less than 1% issue, but you could end up inadvertently coming across dismissive of an entire identity group.
Yeah, I mean, I really understand the tension in your question, but I do
Mm-hmm.
think that the reality of scope and scale matters. And so this is the sort of second part to my last answer, which is the moment on C-SPAN where, Sarah McBride says, anytime a large, powerful force, a group of people is targeting a very small minoritized community, you have to start asking why. And I think that the overwhelming attention to trans people in sports and trans inclusion in sports is yet another example of taking an issue that impacts a very small minority of folks and creating a political firestorm around it. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with addressing the reality of scale, which is to say, how many athletes are we talking about? In what way is this actually harming communities, families, folks who are trying to do right by the folks that they love?
Had you done a very campaign-oriented doc before? What was your familiarity with Washington or campaigns? I'm just curious.
No, this is my first verite doc of this kind, and a lot of my prior documentary work really sits at the edges of nonfiction as a genre, so pulls in a lot of narrative cinema making styles and techniques. And I was really thrilled by the opportunity to jump into this style because there is so much cinematic potential in verite documentary storytelling. And the collaboration that I had with our cinematographer, Melissa Langer, was a way in which to think like, what can the frame of the camera, what can the frame of the picture do to help us tell this story? It's not simply being in the room at the right time. It's how can we actually organize the structure of our frame such that you as the viewer can be interpreting multiple things simultaneously.
Look, I think it allows the documentary not to age as quickly.
Yes.
I
couldn't
think
agree more.
I think they live longer if you can feel like you can transport yourself in time.
Yes, absolutely. And to really think about it, I think that there's a kind of fantasy that cameras just arrive in rooms and tell stories because they're there. And it's just so far beyond. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here talking to you, but like, what role does something like the car play in a story like this, where you recognize that in the context of our storytelling, the car becomes a space that's both public and private. It's where Sarah is the most open and most vulnerable to certain kinds of questions. She is both in private, but she's also in the world. And those kinds of tensions are something that the camera can help us to reveal.
Did you ask all the questions, or did others in your team do it as well?
I definitely was the one in conversation with her throughout, with the exception of the journalists who you see on screen, where we're using those questions as well. But yeah, it was very much me.
Let me just ask you a question. Take your director's hat off here for a second. What do you make of how politics is conducted? Here you were. I mean, you were on the ground watching a Congress. It was essentially a fairly normal congressional race, although not in a big TV market because of the weirdness of Delaware being sort of connected to a big media market, but not technically. Wilmington is its own small sort of subgenre of Philadelphia. But I'm just curious, as an American citizen, what did you make of how campaigning circa 2024 was like?
This is where I have to disclose to you that I'm Canadian, and also
even
to say
better. That's what I mean. Give me a Canadian's eye view of this. And I apologize that we're stealing hockey from you guys. I grew up in Florida. I grew up in Florida, and you know why all these Florida teams are so good at hockey? Because all you Canadians moved to Florida. But anyway,
this is our next conversation.
You used to, not anymore. Yeah, I know. Now they're not coming. But anyway,
yeah, exactly.
But okay, even better. You're Canadian, so you're in a weird way even more distant from it. So, I always say that I have cynical eyes, so I may miss stuff that somebody with fresher eyes may see. So I'm just curious what you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fairness, I moved to the US for the first time at 19. So lots of experience here to reflect upon, and especially as someone who transitioned in the States. The thing that I was most struck by in telling this story is the theatricality of the political moment and the ways in which politics dominates public space. So I'm thinking a lot about the debates, the billboards, the lawn signs. It might sound simple, but it's actually not, because when we're driving through Delaware, for example, you are immersed in a kind of political culture that is material. You are confronting messaging and signs in a variety of different ways. And I was thinking a lot about a kind of politics of intimidation, right? Where people show up, look certain ways, take up space in certain ways. And that's something that you feel in your body when you're on the ground in these environments, and certainly not something that I had paid attention to in the same way prior to making the film. I think we are inundated by screen media, but the material world is so different.
Delaware actually is a unique situation with the sign issue because there's not a dominant TV market, because buying television for a Delaware viewer, it means buying Philadelphia, which is expensive. Yard signs are everything. So, and everybody has to do the yard signs, the state Senate candidates, the city council
Yes.
candidates, the auditor, the dog catcher, you name it. So I think Delaware, if my memory serves, when you're driving through, in election season, it is an area that you're more likely to see yard signs than you would in a place with dominant TV. Let me ask you about being in and around our U.S. Congress.
Mhm.
What'd you make of that? And what surprised? What did you may have had a stereotype going in. Anything surprised you coming out?
hmm Again, I think I'm revealing myself as a formalist here in the ways in which I'm answering, but there was something quite haunting to me about shooting in the tunnels with Sarah McBride that were the same tunnels that Marjorie Taylor Greene and other politicians were leveraging their power against trans folks, and recognizing that those walls are holding those same concurrent flows. And again, really trying to think from a cinematic perspective of how do we bring you, the viewer, into that space with us so that you can feel the power, the
Small.
claustrophobia, the
Yeah.
tension of these spaces. And again, that's something that I'm really grateful to be able to do with a camera, which is to say, where are we and how are we in this together? And then there's something really, again, striking to me about how new it is for Congresswoman McBride. She will
Mhm.
say she's still getting lost in this space. And so you're in this moment of exploration and curiosity at the same time as this violent tide is approaching. And the tension is really captured in the geography and architecture of that space.
Yeah, it's shocking that people spend upwards of $20 to $30 million for cubicle office space, right? Like, it's so small.
Yeah. Yeah. So small.
I want to another thing that she says towards the end of the doc that I found, it made me think, and I was going back, is that she's the first where a majority of her voters did not share her identity. The
Mhm.
first woman of Congress, obviously you had to have to, there. First African American, first Latino, for the most part, all got there because their identity group, got behind them in their community. Um, I thought that was a fascinating. I guess because even the first out member of Congress in the gay community were sort of forced out, right? They didn't get there. Barney Frank and Jerry Studs were outed while they were in Congress. I guess you would say, I guess Tammy Baldwin would be the first one who ran and won as somebody who was out, and so they would have a majority of their constituents not. But I thought that was a fascinating, and that's hard to capture. And I don't, and I think that is unique. I couldn't think of, was trying to come up with any other corollary, and I couldn't come up with one.
No, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to include that anecdote toward the end of our film because I think it's also revealing of the ways in which Sarah McBride is a student of politics in a very profound, whether it's
She's
watching
clearly a history
the
junkie.
West
Yeah,
Wing or being
yeah.
at a podium as a kid, is really thinking critically about her position and thinking historically about her position. And
Mm-hmm.
as a result, I think it causes us to have to turn toward the many problems of being a first in any category of representation, and also the ways in which she's approaching herself. And I read a lot of nuance in that declaration from her, and a lot of thinking out loud about what she's experiencing.
Uh, I don't want to ask you to speak for the entire trans community, just like she's obviously doesn't want to be forced to always have to be the congresswoman for the entire trans community. And yet there's going to be pressures for her to do that.
Mhm.
Um, how does she push back on that pressure?
I think
And
that
is there
that's
a good way to
definitely,
do it? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a question you should ask her. I can answer it for myself
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
answer it for in the context of the film, which is to say, one of the central tensions is about activist versus electoral strategies of social change, right? What does it mean to be advocating for or on behalf of certain groups of people? And I think we land in the film with an opportunity to consider multiple strategies of approach. And my hope is that we walk away recognizing we need all of them at once. And I don't think, speaking on behalf of a community ever works in any context, but rather to say that communities are deeply multifaceted and require a multi-pronged approach that is multi-issue at every turn and could never be distilled down to these are the needs of trans people, because trans people are so multiply identified.
The history of our country when it comes to civil rights has always been incrementalism, right? There's been small gains. And there are people that will say, that's dehumanizing, right? Small gains. And yet, in order to get all the gains, civil unions today would be considered a step back, but 25 years ago, that was a step forward. That I imagine is the toughest part. I think that's the toughest position she's being put in. And it's going to be among the harder things to communicate to the trans community, just like it was for African-American leaders in the 50s to say, look, we're doing desegregation. We're going to get the full voting rights at this point. We're going to do, it is. And yet if you're the victim of basically you don't have patience, right? I just find it's just hard. And I know I'm not saying anything you don't know, you live it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where I find the most inspiration being a filmmaker and being an artist, because I think documentary is one of the ways in which we get to renegotiate power and shine spotlights back out into certain places in culture. And so I think that my hope for our film is that it's a way to continue energizing this conversation and to think together about, what does it mean to meaningfully approach social change in this moment? And what is the relationship between incrementalism and more radical acts?
And there's always, we're such a contradiction as a country, right? We're live and let live, right? We're sort of in some ways that was, we revolted due to wanting more freedom, but then we get upset when other people want more freedom. But how do you feel long-term optimistic, short-term pessimistic?
I find a lot of power in knowing that trans people have always been here and have always survived, and that has required various approaches to public life. That's required being more private, being more opaque, being more visible, being more audible. And I think that we're in a moment of deep and necessary recalibration. And I have full faith that we will thrive and survive.
But I guess do you feel more optimistic even? I just wonder, because in some ways it goes back to the apocryphal quote, which is the fact that there's so much attention that the right's trying to bring to this issue. Is it oddly empowering?
I will say that it is incredibly exciting to be a part of a world that is full of trans people who are saying absolutely not. And we will continue to advocate and fight for our community. And I feel deeply embedded in and grateful to those communities and momentums.
Now, let me flip on are you worried that the Democratic Party is going to abandon the trans community?
That is a question for Congresswoman McBride as well. I think that I am, I am concerned about the ways in which the trans community has been positioned as both scapegoat and wedge, and the time for that to change.
Look, you lean into the Kamala Harris ad. I mean, what I found very impressive with what you did is that you're like, okay, we're not going to avoid this conversation. We know, and it turned out to be, it is the symbol of Kamala Harris messed up because of that ad, right? Not responding to that ad. You lean into it because it appears it's like, you're like, okay, we're going to get scapegoated.
That's it. You can watch it happening, right? You can watch it unfold. And I think, again, the more we can draw attention to the way in which it works, the way in which these rhetorical moves are constructed, the better able we are going to be to untangle them.
Well, look, feature-length documentaries are not easy at all because it's got to be a story. It's got to be a narrative. It's got to feel like a movie, right? People want a beginning, a middle, and an end, no matter how important the subject matter is. And you found that right mix. And like I said, I think this is going to age extraordinarily well.
Thank you, Chuck. I really appreciate it. Thanks for this conversation.
Well, it was fun to get to know you. Thanks, Chase.
Likewise.
All right. In the second half of the conversation, I now have Congresswoman Sarah McBride joining me. Congresswoman, welcome to the ToddCast. As I say, you're following the director, Chase Joynt. We literally, this is not the magic of editing. Chase just left the Zoom. Congresswoman McBride just joined it. So thank you.
It's great to join you, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
Let me just start a couple of questions on the doc. Was it a hard decision to let that kind of, I mean, you had to let people in to private moments. I'm not sure how much I lived a life like that and I didn't love it all the time. So was it a hard decision to allow this to happen?
It was definitely a decision that I thought a lot about. But I came to the conclusion that it was easy to tell a simple story through headlines and passive coverage of this journey to Congress and stepping into office, but that you don't really learn good lessons from simple stories. And I wanted to invite an incredibly thoughtful director in Chase and to grapple with the complexities and the challenges of running for office, of serving in public office, and doing all of that as a part of a community that's never been present before. Because I think when you tell that deep of a story with all of its complexities and challenges, other people can learn from it so that hopefully, one, they can do it too, and two, they can do it better.
Whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not, you're a symbol for, right? When you're a first, when you're having to break a barrier, you break a ceiling, however you want to describe it. In some ways you carry the hopes and dreams of every transgender person on your shoulders, which is a huge burden. And at the same time, it's an unfair burden, right? And you sort of address this towards the end. You strike me as somewhat reluctant to be that symbol, yet you're accepting that you have to be.
I recognize that with opportunity comes responsibility, and when you are a first, that comes with extra responsibilities. And so,
is that the guidance of Spider-Man there, by the way? Right?
Exactly.
With great power, right?
And I recognize that when you are a first, there is added responsibility, and sometimes it's not always fair. I don't feel sorry for myself. I know how lucky I am. I feel genuinely lucky. But I also believe, I don't push back against that extra responsibility because I don't want it. I just genuinely believe that the only way I can fulfill that responsibility is to quite simply be the best member of Congress that I can be. I think when you are a first, people viscerally feel your highs and they viscerally feel your lows, and they put a lot on you. And I understand that. And I think one of the things I hope we would have more of in our politics is a degree of grace to ourselves, a degree of grace to one another in our own coalition and in our own communities, and a degree of grace to one another across the partisan and political divide. And, I think when we allow ourselves to be seen in our fuller humanity, we invite a little bit more grace. And look, I'm not going to always get this right. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm doing the best I can. And I've tried to look, as I talk about in the documentary, I've tried to look for other examples of firsts who are coming in at a time when the identity that makes them a first is at the center of political debate, and the district that they represent isn't significantly or predominantly made up of that identity. And
I found that to be a fascinating observation that you made. And I was talking actually to Chase about this, not literally towards the end, because I was sitting there going, boy, I was coming up. I mean, I guess, maybe a Native American member of Congress, but I couldn't. It was a fascinating observation that you made there, and you're right. But it also says a lot about where you come from in your district. For whatever anybody else is looking at you, if they are only caught up with your identity, if that had been the case in Delaware, I don't think you would have won.
No, I would not have. And, I think I genuinely feel such deep love for Delaware. I have felt it my entire life. I think I have seen throughout my life, throughout my career as an advocate and now as an elected official, that Delaware, particularly as a small state, a state of neighbors, is able to see past
Right.
sort of.
In some ways, small state would have been is easier to at least
Yeah,
get people to see you as a three-dimensional figure. I always
exactly.
say our biggest problem in our politics, conversations with media, I used to feel this myself. I still feel it, if you're a two-dimensional figure to somebody, it's easy to say horrible things. The
Exactly.
minute people find out, oh, whoa, they're human, just like me, it's amazing what they won't say to your face, right?
It's difficult to hate up close. And I think that being a state of neighbors helps to foster a politics that sees our elected officials, who we see at the grocery store and out at parades all the time, as real people. But also, that wouldn't have happened if I also wasn't running on a platform that represented the diverse needs of Delawareans, and on a record in the state Senate of working on paid family medical leave and healthcare. And so Delaware was primed to see me as a whole person, but I also had to put myself forward as a whole person. And I think sometimes, even on our own side, we try to box people into that one thing and reduce them to that one thing. And listen, if I wanted to talk about trans issues, I could have just stayed as an advocate. I want to work on all issues.
Well, let's talk about the difference. I just want to see your experiences. You were a legislature in the state level. You're now about 200 days in on the federal level. What's the biggest differences, and what's been more similar than you expected?
Dover is definitely very different than DC. I loved my time in the state legislature. I loved being able to roll up my sleeves and negotiate a bill with a Republican colleague outside.
Is it easier to be bipartisan in Dover than it is in DC?
It was, for sure. One, I think partly just the ethos of Delaware politics has historically always been more bipartisan, but
Mike Castle and Joe Biden, right? Those are just very
exactly. And also, I think Delaware, at the state level, we're outside of a lot of the perverse incentives that fill our national politics, in part because of the greater attention that's on our national politics. But I'm still grateful that there are opportunities here, like there were in Delaware, to work in a bipartisan fashion. I think the strategy that I had in Delaware of finding sort of smaller, more technical issues, sort of unsexy, out of the headline issues, to work with Republicans on, to build relationships, develop trust with them over, that then helped me get bipartisan support for paid family and medical leave. That strategy is still very much a strategy you can pursue here. I've introduced 5 bills, 4 of which are bipartisan. And so I think there's a lot of replicable. I think there are replicable strategies that you can employ here. I think the biggest difference is, one, how much this place is a cacophony of feedback and performance and noise, and how much that reality can bring out some of the worst in some people, and how much you see the strategy of reality TV employed by some in Congress in a way that just didn't exist.
I had a member of Congress who's no longer a member of Congress by choice. This is a conservative Republican from Kansas who was very frustrated, very much not a Marjorie Taylor Greene type of performer, but is Jake LaTurner, much more of a, was sort of a Paul Ryan acolyte, and sort of admitted that one of the reasons people do the performative, it's the only way their constituents know they exist. Right. That this has been also it's almost like proof of life. And, Delaware's a small state. There's a little more local interest in what everybody's doing. You come from some of these bigger metropolitan areas, and they have a hard time standing out. And I hate that that's probably the initial reason why some of these folks started to become cable TV clowns.
Yeah, I think, look, attention is a tool to be an effective legislator, to push for change, to increase your power, to influence things. And I think everyone here has to figure out how to be heard. But to your point, I think there are some folks for whom the rush that comes with attention ends up making that attention the end rather than the means.
me ask you a couple of Delaware-centric questions. One is just sort of demographic, because I now fully appreciate that you've been a political junkie since birth. Now that I've heard the stories about the podium and all of that business. So when for the longest time, Delaware, Missouri were the two states that always voted with the winner. For most of my lifetime, until I think it was I guess if we measured it by popular vote, it was 04.
Yes.
What's your explanation of why Delaware is no longer at the fulcrum? Is it more of a function of the right or a function of the left?
I think it is mostly a function of the right. Our
the Mike Castle Republicans don't exist. Are they extinct?
I think they are all Democrats now, pretty much. And I think that, quite candidly, I think the Republican Party in Delaware lost the center. And I think the Democratic Party in Delaware has maintained proximity to public opinion in a way that has allowed us to dominate elections, which is not always true in the national conversation. It's not always true in every state party. I think that the Democratic Party has done a good job of building a broad tent that has allowed us to maintain a solid majority in Delaware. Now, that obviously, I think there are some pretty significant demographic shifts that are happening in Delaware right now. The influx of retirees, that'll be interesting.
What's been the beginning of that? Just people moving out of Philadelphia and New Jersey for cheaper, lower taxes.
The relatively low tax burden has created a really welcoming environment for retirees on fixed incomes to move to Delaware from both Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and from the Maryland and Virginia area. I think one of the things we saw in the last election, though, is while Democrats saw a slight decrease in our traditionally bluer areas, that
like
was
in and around Wilmington,
around Wilmington, not dissimilar from the drop we've seen in Democratic support in heavy Democratic areas and other places. We actually saw an increase in Democratic support in our historically Republican area because of the number of retirees from Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York who have moved in and are skewing more Democratic. So it's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing right now. Sort of the college-educated retirees that are moving to Delaware are compensating for that loss in some historically Democratic strongholds.
Interesting. What Delaware's other identity is the home of every corporation, right? They get this, whatever it is, protect a lot of extra legal protection, some things that many people don't like, including many people in the Democratic Party are, I think, have a harder and harder time defending some of that. Where are you on that? And do you think it's been a net positive or a net negative for Delaware being sort of the home of corporate America, the headquarters for corporate America?
Well, as you mentioned, Delaware's franchise is a significant source of funding for our state. Delaware's legal economy is a significant source of economic activity as well as revenue for Delaware. Roughly 30 to 40% of our state revenue comes from either the franchise itself or revenue that's coming in from economic activity around the incorporation and legal disputes being handled by what's called our Chancery Court. That means that we get to fund services for vulnerable Delawareans through revenue coming in from corporations. And that's a fairly progressive way to fund services for the vulnerable.
You are taking away tax dollars from the places those companies are actually headquartered in, right? That could be the other.
Well, they still have to. They still have to pay, taxes where they have a physical footprint. But I think they
get to avoid some of it by incorporating in Delaware.
I think the reason why these companies are incorporating in Delaware is because we have an efficient Department of State around incorporation, very responsive, that's really honed its capacity to be seamless and efficient in processing all of the sort of bureaucratic and logistical paperwork and necessities that come with incorporation. But then most specifically and most significantly, we have a significant amount of case law that is a byproduct of our Chancery Court. It's a specialized equity court that's focused on business disputes. And that means that it has a wide and deep bench of both talent in the bar and on the bench, but also a deep bench of case law that provides predictability and stability for corporations so that they understand what the guardrails are. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what is actually resulting in these particularly major corporations coming to Delaware to incorporate. And it's really that we are providing a degree of stability and predictability for these businesses in our well-respected Chancery Court.
Are you nervous about what Texas is up to, trying to basically take a piece of this pie from Delaware?
I mean, look, there's a competition right now. Texas, Nevada are trying to encroach in this space. But our incorporations continue to rise in Delaware. We're not actually seeing, when you look at the data, a drop in the growth of incorporation in Delaware. And look, I think Delaware has this stable and predictable environment for businesses to operate that seeks to balance all of the different interests and needs and protections that workers, consumers, and shareholders require. I don't want to see a race to the bottom, and I obviously want to make sure that Delaware maintains its preeminence in this space. I think that the one thing that Texas and Nevada can't replicate, they can try to pass, a corporate governance structure that's similar to ours, but what they can't replicate is the depth and detail of our case law, the experience that our judges and our attorneys have. Certainly, they can't do it overnight. And I think it's one of the reasons why we still continue to see incorporations rise in Delaware.
You're awfully close with the Bidens, for a variety of reasons. And look, it was, I think he's been a patron of your political career, no doubt, and then some. What do you make of as somebody who's a member of an identity group that's getting scapegoated? What do you make of the scapegoating on Biden? And do you think some of the criticism is fair?
Look, I said when the president decided to exit the race that he was making a patriotic and selfless decision.
You thought it was in the best interest of the party and the country for him not to seek re-election.
I thought he made the right decision to hand the baton to a new generation.
You think the outcome would have been different if he hadn't?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I do think that Kamala Harris ran a great campaign, and I think there was a burst of momentum that probably did enhance the outcome. I don't know if the outcome would have changed if that decision had been made and that change had occurred earlier or not. I can't speak to that. What I do know is that Joe Biden made a really difficult decision, and he put the country first. He put the party first, and he put the country first in stepping aside and handing the baton to Vice President Harris for that election. And
it doesn't seem like he did it it seems like he was pretty reluctant.
Well, look, I think often self-sacrifice is a reluctant step. It's not a decision that you come to easily. And, I think for me, I will say, I think we have a lot on our plate right now, and I get why people are having these conversations. I think these are fair. I will say for me right now, though, my friend just got diagnosed with cancer, and I am really consumed with just wishing him well.
How often do you talk with him?
I've seen him about once a month over the last couple of months. I saw him once in December, once in January, once in February, and
on the Amtrak, of course, right?
Yes, of course, on the Amtrak. I actually just saw him at the Memorial Day ceremony and gave him a big hug. And obviously, it was the first time I saw him since his cancer diagnosis, and just told him how much I love him.
Your leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, certainly hasn't been able to avoid some arrows and some frustrations of Democrats, either saying he should be pushing back harder or punching back harder, or is there a plan? Schumer's been hearing it in the Senate as well, right? This is not a happy group of Democrats, what are there things you wish your leaders were doing differently with Trump, or do you think this is the hand they were dealt?
Look, I think folks are scared right now, and understandably, people want to find a magic wand or an easy button, or think that one strategy or one approach can solve everything. I think Hakeem Jeffries is doing a fantastic job as the leader of the Democratic caucus in a very difficult circumstance. And I think he is absolutely right that we need to keep the main thing the main thing. That's something we talk about as a caucus quite frequently, something he talks to us about. And that means in this moment, really focusing in, shining a light, and fighting back on this heartless, big, ugly bill that the Republicans are trying to ram through that would result in the largest evisceration of healthcare in American history. And that is a strategy. That is the strategy. Because at the end of the day, if we are going to build a majoritarian coalition that not only wins the next election, but creates a sustainable opposition to Trump and Trumpism, we have to convince people who voted for this president in the last election that he's doing a bad job. And that's not necessarily viscerally comforting to ourselves, but meeting voters where they are, focusing on the things that they care about, even if it's not what is populating X or blue sky. That's politics. That's the hard work of democracy and change making. And I think we have to stop fighting fights that feel viscerally comforting to us in ways that feel viscerally comforting to us, that don't actually move the ball forward in building our coalition.
You sound like Ro Khanna, who I think I just was reading, was saying, hey, Democrats ought to reach out to Elon Musk right now, while others want to throw him away. What would you say to that?
I'll let.
And I would assume Elon Musk is a complicated figure for look. There's and I understand if that's a bridge. Elon Musk might be a bridge too far for you, and I would understand that given his behavior.
I don't know what I think on that conversation, to be quite honest. But what I do firmly believe is that we have to be a bigger tent as a party. We have to welcome in diversity of thought.
Under that guise, because you saw Gavin Newsom do it, you've seen Seth Moulton do it. Are you going to consider somebody an ally if they're for trans rights but don't want to see trans women competing in women's sports? Is that person an ally to you or not?
Well, I think two things I would say. First, I think there's a different question about whether someone says that there is nuance in this conversation, that there are legitimate questions, and someone who's trying to ban all trans people from extracurricular programs, regardless of age, regardless of sport.
The competition conversation specific when it comes to should this be in this you're willing to have that conversation, not the all trans people are out type of.
I think it is an entirely reasonable position for someone to say that there are very understandable concerns about how to balance fairness and respect in sports. And the entities that are best able to grapple with those questions are individual athletic associations that best understand their sport and the science and the data. I think that's an entirely reasonable position. And that is, I think, a position that even for folks who are more conservative on this question, voters who are more conservative on this question, they can understand that we've got serious problems as a country. And even if you have a concern about that issue, that is it really the right place for that issue to not only be handled in, but for time and energy to be spent on? Is the U.S. House of Representatives really the right space for that to happen? And I think most voters can get behind that perspective on this issue. But what I will say is, beyond sort of the specifics of that, I do think we have to move past a purity politics. I do think we have to move past a place where the only way to be considered an ally is to be perfect on every issue. The reality is that if you want to defend trans rights in non-discrimination protections writ large, from a clear effort by right-wing politicians to legalize discrimination in all of its forms, if you want to build a coalition that's 51%, or frankly, more necessarily 60 or 70%, by definition, you will have to include people who are in the 70% who oppose trans people participating in sports consistent with their gender identity. That is the reality of the math. And I'm here to welcome imperfect allies. I'm here to say, you want to side with dignity and fairness. You want to side with being kind. You might have disagreements on particular aspects of how that looks and what are the right specific policies. But generally speaking, you want to do right by your neighbors who are across the diversity of gender in our society. Welcome to our coalition. Welcome to our party. I am not going to shed imperfect allies, because that'll get us a great, morally pure, miserable club at the gulag we've all been sent off to.
Are you worried about backlash in your own community, in the trans community, that says you're not fighting hard enough? Don't compromise our rights. Don't compromise our values.
Yeah, I mean, I
know I'm putting you in the proverbial box here, but look, a lot of people, I heard it. You accepted the Speaker of the House's decision on the bathroom.
Yeah,
you didn't fight it, and I thought your explanation in the movie was frankly a correct fear, which is if you fought it, if you protested, they might have expelled you.
Yeah. Or someone could have committed violence against me.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a notable person. There could have been a bounty on my head. I'm not compromising on my own existence. I'm not compromising on the principle of equal rights. Mm-hmm. But people also have to recognize that there's a principle of harm reduction, and that liberal democracy sadly requires compromise. Absolutism.
Look, we wouldn't have gotten same-sex marriage if we didn't have civil unions first.
That's correct. That's correct. And I think the sort of, you can't compromise on human rights, that is a great principle to fight for, or ideal to fight for. My
whole life has been I've watched incremental progress on civil rights.
Tell me,
compromise, right?
Tell me which civil rights act delivered full equality for people of color and had absolutely no compromise. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or any of the civil rights acts that have passed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Every single social movement has been disciplined, strategic, effective, picked their battles, and yes, made compromises. That doesn't mean that that's our starting point. It doesn't mean that that's what we fight for in the long run. But at the end of the day, progress is essential to progressivism. We have to move the ball forward. And we are not in this moment. We are not in this moment because of trans folks or our community, but we are also not in this moment because we weren't canceling people enough, correcting people enough, shaming people enough, or not fighting for the ideal.
Your level of concern that trans people will be scapegoated by the Democratic Party over the next 2 years out of desperation to win to win elections. I asked Chase this question, and I got the sense that he's a little nervous about it, but he said, "Oh, ask her."
Yeah, I'm confident that our party is committed to equal rights. I am confident our party is going to continue to engage in an approach to politics and change making that maximizes positive outcomes and minimizes risk for the vulnerable people that we are fighting for. I just heard Leader Jeffries and Leader Schumer last night very proudly and very clearly defend LGBTQ people and say that we are committed to trans rights. I'm not worried about people throwing trans people under the bus within the Democratic Party. I also think that we have to separate words and rhetoric from specific votes, and recognize that if we can't even accept some diversity of thought in the messaging that we use, then we've lost the plot. We have become so consumed with language that we have forgotten that the people who we are fighting for, not the folks on social media, frankly, not the folks who are living in pretty darn good environments in deep blue areas where they're surrounded by people that are like them, but the LGBTQ person in deep red Iowa, or the trans young person in a rural community. They need tangible progress. They don't need us prioritizing battles over what is the right language and message that we use and how we reach people. They have to do it every single day. They have to interact with people and engage with people and meet people every single day who aren't yet on our side. I think they need a degree of radical and urgent pragmatism in how we move the ball forward and how we stave off these fights. We've got to recognize the reality of political power in this moment, and we've got to recognize the reality of public opinion in this moment. Otherwise, we will only see a further regression in both public opinion and in public policy on these issues.
I think I know the answer to this, but if Donald Trump invited you for an Oval Office meeting, I assume you wouldn't hesitate.
I don't anticipate that happening.
I don't either, but don't say it never with him.
Listen, I have a strict rule just as a principle that I never, ever refuse to engage with someone, no matter how much I disagree with them. And I think we have to get past this notion that strategy, that talking with people, that working with people is a form of selling out or compromise. I think we have to recognize that one of the problems in our politics is that we have no grace and we are unwilling to talk with one another.
What is success for you in a congressional career? And is Congress your last stop?
I just got here.
I know. So, but you have an idea of what, when your career is over, what do you hope is something that you got done?
I think two things. One, I want to be part of the Congress that modernizes our care infrastructure. We have a 1950s care infrastructure for a 2025 workforce. I ran for office because of my experience, as I talk about in the documentary, as a caregiver. And I believe that in the wealthiest, most developed nation on earth, that the ability to get care and the time to get care should not be a matter of luck. And so I want to be part of a Congress that passes paid family and medical leave for every worker in this country, that provides affordable childcare for every family in this country. I want to be part of a Congress that modernizes that care infrastructure. Two, I hope that sooner rather than later, while I may be a first, I'm very clearly not the last. And I think that only happens if I show people in districts across this country, including my own constituents, that when people like me are elected, we can do the whole job and we can do it effectively.
Well, look, I'm not going to put ambition in your head, but when you're practicing presidential speeches as a child, I will tell you this: I've never met somebody who ran for president who said they hadn't thought about it for years. You ever dreamed about it as a kid?
I mean, yes, but
Amy Klobuchar admitted to me she first thought about it in high school, and I always thought, good for you for at least admitting it, because most of these people don't admit that.
But I also wouldn't be the first young person to change my dream. When I was 5 and 6,
also probably might be a firefighter.
I was just with my niece Juliet, and I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" She's 9 years old. She said she wants to be the president of the United States. Yeah. I was thrilled to hear that. I'm very confident that if a McBride becomes president, she will be the first McBride to become president. I like naps too much to want to become president.
I could make a nap joke in president, but I'm not going to. We're going over to time. Sarah McBride, it's good to get to know you. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Great to meet you.